A human story editor would see grief at the heart of every page. Elise is not only fighting instructors, terrain, and impossible standards. She is carrying the voice of a father who taught her to read the wind long before the army ever tested her. Every crawl, every shot, every humiliation becomes part of a promise made in a hospital room. By the time she lies behind the rifle for the final impossible target, this is no longer just qualification. It is love refusing to die.
Staff Sergeant Thorne steadied the M40, feeling the breeze. The plate, a pinprick at 1,247 meters, was a shot Lejeune called a myth. For 40 years, that target gathered rust. Gunny Hessler was already marking her as a fail. But her father taught her to shoot on worse ground. His memory was a rucksack she never took off. She felt his hand on her shoulder, a ghost from his Montana grave. Getting to this moment meant surviving 3 weeks of pure hell. It started 8 months ago, in a sterile Missoula hospital room. Cancer had whittled Thomas Thorne down to a frame, but at 68, his sniper's hands were still granite as his body gave out. Elise felt the history in their calluses. "Promise me," her father rasped. Outside, the Bitterroot Mountains serrated the sky. In those peaks, she learned patience wasn't waiting, but a weapon you forge, a habit built from sheer will. Anything, she swore. His eyes, sharp as ever, drilled into her. "Finish it," he said. "The scout sniper I couldn't be." The words were a vice on her ribs. He was a backcountry legend, but never wore the eagle, globe, and anchor for which she'd enlisted. "I tried," she whispered. "Twice. Got sent home from Iraq. Then the stand. The waiver, he cut in. One last shot. His grip was a shock. Medboard signed off. You got till March 2026. Your last chance." He pulled her close. "Make it count. Show him a thorn's worth." 3 weeks later, she said it again, over his casket in the rain. That promise burned in her gut now, at the edge of Lejeune's ranges. The bus from Pendleton had spit her out before dawn. 23 other hopefuls were shadows in the gloom. She was the lone woman. The check-in NCO fumbled her name. Thorne Elise. Staff Sergeant. Here for the basic course. It was a statement, not a question, she confirmed. He slammed the stamp down, avoiding her eyes, and jerked a thumb toward the squad bay. His silence was loud enough. The barracks hallway reeked of CLP, boot polish, and failure. Elise claimed a rack. The chatter died. A slick-sleeved corporal with a smirk watched her drop her sea bag. She paid him no mind. A jumpy-looking PFC across the way gave a quick nod. She nodded back. Formation was at 0500. 24 souls on shattered asphalt. Elise tried to disappear in the second rank, knowing it was useless. Gunnery Sergeant Brock Hessler prowled the formation. He was built like a cinder block, with a scowl to match. His cold eyes sized up every Marine with pure disdain. He'd stop, poke a candidate, then move on. He stopped at Elise. "Staff Sergeant Thorne," he said, making her name sound like dirt. "Second Martiv," he read from a clipboard. 2 pumps. Iraq, Afghanistan. He paused. Expert badge, and 2 medical washouts. Shrapnel, compound fracture. A grin without humor touched his lips. "So, Staff Sergeant, why are you here?" Her eyes stayed locked forward. "To be a scout sniper, gunnery sergeant?" "Wrong," he bellowed. "You're a number for a quota. You're a photo op for some colonel. You're here because the Corps got soft." He scanned the others. "My house has standards. That's it. Quotas don't pass. Photo ops quit." He looked back at her, his voice a low threat. "I'll give you 1 week, if you're lucky." He walked off, leaving her in the crosshairs of 23 other Marines. The ground had shifted. The corporal's smirk was wider now. The PFC looked away. No one seemed shocked. That night, she pulled a creased photo from her wallet. Her dad, 12 years younger, smiling in a field with his rifle. Behind him, the Bitterroots were silent giants. Her thumb traced the worn edge. "I'm here," she whispered to the dark. "Gotta see it through." She turned it over. 3 promises in his script. 1, high school. Check. 2, honorable service. Check. 3, Marine Scout Sniper. The box was empty. She would either check it in 3 weeks or she would shatter. The next day, Hessler made the game plain. During his ballistics lecture, he fired questions at her. She aced one about windage, using a trick her dad taught her. He told her she was wrong and moved on. He cut her off when she tried to explain Mirage, praising Corporal Vance for a garbage answer. Competence was irrelevant. But she'd learned patience from a man who could wait 19 hours in the freezing cold. She'd learned resolve from a father whose glances were speeches. You only lose when you let the enemy inside the wire. Gunnery Sergeant Hessler wanted her to break. He had no idea who she was. For 3 days, it was the same script. Hessler lectured, she knew the answer, he shot her down. The others just watched. Day 4, the routine broke. A new instructor walked in, mid-30s, with the quiet confidence of a man who'd seen combat, a MARSOC Raider patch on his sleeve. His eyes scanned the room, a practiced inventory. Sergeant First Class Marcus Webb, he said, assisting with your marksmanship block. He didn't give her a second look. He didn't treat her like an agenda item, just another Marine. After days under Hessler's microscope, it felt like breathing again. Webb's style was the inverse of Hessler's. Hessler dictated, Webb taught. Hessler punished questions. Webb invited them. He posed a problem, an 800-meter shot in a tough crosswind. Elise answered immediately. Her solution was surgically precise, straight from her dad's playbook. She included variables the manuals miss: temperature, altitude, and drift. When she finished, Webb nodded slowly. Solid, he said, his eyes noting her like a data point. Hessler appeared then, leaning in the back, his glare fixed on Webb. After class, he blocked her path. Sucking up to the new guy, he sneered. She didn't bite. He crowded her. It won't help. Webb doesn't run the final qual. I do. She held his gaze for 2 hard seconds, then walked by. It was a small win. That evening, Elise was outside, reviewing wind charts in her head as the heat finally broke. Gravel crunched behind her. Staff Sergeant Thorne, she turned. It was Webb, Sergeant First Class. He nodded toward the trees. Walk with me. They moved away from the barracks. Webb was quiet for a moment, choosing his words. That wind call today, he started. You used factors that aren't in the book. The question was unspoken but clear. My father taught me, she said. 40 years hunting Montana. The wind's different up there. You learn to read what the books miss, or you go home empty. Webb nodded. Thomas Thorne. It wasn't a question. Elise froze. You knew him? The name, Webb said. Guys in that world talk about him like a myth. Say he could make impossible shots. Said he taught his kid everything. He paused, meeting her eyes. They also say she might be even better. A knot formed in Elise's chest. Her dad was a legend, his name a password in gun shops. To be compared to him was both an honor and a crushing burden. I'm trying, she said, her voice quiet. Webb just stood there for a second. My hands are tied with Hessler. Staff Sergeant, he began. The regs give him final call. What I can do is ensure your performance is logged by the book. He locked eyes with her. If you're as good as they say, the data will prove it. It wasn't an offer of help, but one of impartiality, her only weapon in a fixed game. Thanks, Gunny. He shook his head. Don't. This just makes him dig in harder. You threaten his entire view of women in this line of work. He turned toward the squad bay. There's more, he added, looking back. Hessler's sister, Caroline, tried for Ranger School in 2011. A physical stud, top of her class, looked like a sure thing. She made it to the final phase, then just broke. A total psychotic episode. Seeing things completely gone. Discharged, institutionalized, the whole 9 yards. A knot of ice formed in Elise's stomach. He expects me to snap like she did. No, Webb corrected. He's terrified you will. That's why he's trying to wash you out. In his own messed up logic, he's protecting you. He left her standing in the humid Carolina night. Hessler wasn't just prejudiced. He was a man tormented by a ghost. Understanding wasn't absolution. It was ammunition. The word came down at evening formation. Tomorrow, Hessler's voice sliced through the quiet, is the initial live fire qual. Known distance, 100 to 600 yards. Shooting fundamentals. This is what weeds out the wannabes. His gaze settled on Elise. Some of you will find this difficult. For others, it's where you'll realize you don't belong here. His smile was a cold void. I'm eager to see who cracks. That night, Elise field stripped her weapon 3 times. She confirmed her scope's 0 until she was certain, then checked again. Windage calculations scrolled through her mind until they blurred. In her rack, she studied her father's old photograph. He looked out from a field in Montana, a master's quiet confidence immortalized. Tomorrow, she breathed. I'm going to show them what you taught me. She recalled the long days he'd spent teaching her to read the wind by the sway of the grass or a shimmer of heat. She remembered being 15, hitting a 900-yard target on a shot he said was the finest he'd ever witnessed. Their last hunt together. Now, a dozen years on, she would leverage every lesson to beat a test rigged against her. She turned the photo over. The last line remained unchecked. Asterisk, become Marine Scout sniper. Asterisk, almost there, she promised. Almost there, Dad. The range at Lejeune was a flat, bleached-out field. Targets dotted the landscape from 100 to 600 yards. 24 shooters found their firing positions. The air was thick with tension beneath a veneer of military discipline. Elise was assigned lane 17. Hessler positioned himself right behind her. She settled into the prone, her cheekbone fused to the stock. The 100-yard target was sharp through her optic, but something was off. The crosshairs felt wrong, off by a micro-adjustment. But she'd been looking through scopes since she was a kid. She knew her rifle's 0 by instinct. Someone had cranked her elevation turret. She stayed perfectly still, denying him the reaction he wanted. She did the math in her head. If it's off this much here, it's a total miss at 600. She would have to compensate on every shot, trusting her instincts over her gear. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. Asterisk. The rifle's just a tool, Elise. You're the weapon. Asterisk. She squeezed the trigger. The bullet struck center mass. She adjusted by feel, not by the dials. Fired. Another solid hit. 5 rounds formed a group you could cover with a quarter. She could feel Hessler's silent shock behind her. At 200 yards, she recalculated. The mental gymnastics got tougher. She fired a round, using the dust kicked up by the impact to adjust, ignoring the reticle. Fired again. Her grouping spread, but was still well within the acceptable margin. 300 yards, then 400. Every new distance required fresh calculations for the compromised scope. Sweat ran down her back, born of concentration, not heat. At 500 yards, her shot group widened. A passing score, but not her best work. The 600-yard line was the true test, the divider between marksmen and artists. Elise controlled her breathing, running the complex calculation one last time. Her scope was lying off by a full minute of angle. Her hold needed to be nearly 6 inches low. She fired. The impact marked the target's chest just left of the heart. A scoring hit, but sloppy. She adjusted instinctively and sent another, closer to the bullseye. Her final 3 rounds tore a single ragged hole, a grouping that was impossible with a tampered rifle. When they called the scores, Elise had passed, ranking high among the candidates. Webb read the list in a monotone voice. Hessler stood next to him, his face a storm of disbelief and suppressed fury. After the range went cold, Elise brought her rifle to the armory. She pulled the optic, checked the dials, and confirmed it. The elevation was 3 clicks off her personal 0. Someone had sabotaged her rifle. The cold knowledge settled deep in her gut. This wasn't over. Hessler would find another way to get rid of her, so be it. If he wanted a war fought in millimeters, that's what he'd get. Elise mounted the optic, spun the dials back to her true 0, and documented it with her phone. Next time, she'd have evidence. Webb appeared at her side. Your scope was off, he said quietly. Elise just nodded. Can you prove someone messed with it? No, Gunny. Then, officially, there's nothing I can do. Webb paused. But passing the qual with compromised gear, not many Marines could pull that off. He met her gaze, And I'll tell you this, it's just going to get worse from here. Elise gave a sharp nod. She knew. Webb started to leave, but stopped. Your father would be proud, Staff Sergeant. The words hit her like a physical blow. Alone in the armory, she let the grief surface for a heartbeat. Then she compartmentalized it and walked back into the sweltering heat. 3 weeks. 3 weeks to outmaneuver Hessler and claim her spot. 3 weeks to take that final, impossible shot. Target 17. She hadn't said it aloud, but the decision was made. That target, the one that had stood undefeated for 40 years, would be hers. Not for the instructors or the other shooters, but for the man buried under the Montana soil who was still watching. She had made a promise. The stalking exercise began Monday. Hessler addressed the group at the edge of a vast, unforgiving wilderness. This is where we separate the shooters from the hunters, he announced, his eyes locked on Elise. This is where people get washed out. Marksmanship got you this far. Fieldcraft will determine if you survive. His smile was pure ice. Out there, accidents happen. Heat casualties, twisted ankles, guys get lost. The implication was clear. I anticipate we'll be thinning the herd this week. The mission brief was simple, but the execution was brutal. Each candidate had to low crawl 800 meters of hostile terrain to an observation post manned by instructors with powerful optics. The objective: get to the firing point, identify the target, and take a shot without being spotted. Get seen, and you fail. 1 failed attempt meant you redid the lane. 3 failures and you were dropped from the course for good. Elise looked at her assignment and felt her stomach clench. Sector 9. The whispers in the barracks were true. It was the northwest quadrant, a brutal stretch of land where rocks tore uniforms and concealment was a fantasy. It was the lane they used for Marines they wanted to break. Her stalk started at 0700. The first 200 meters were a shallow, weed-choked gully. She moved the way her dad taught her, 1 inch at a time, testing the ground, melting into the landscape. A memory surfaced. 12 years old, belly down in a Montana field next to her father, a mule deer grazing 100 yards out. His hand was a steady weight on her back, his voice a whisper. That buck knows you're here, Elise. He can feel you. But if you become part of the earth, part of the quiet, he'll write you off as nothing. That's when you take your shot. She had lain there for 2 hours, muscles screaming in protest, fighting every impulse to shift, to twitch, to do anything but be still. When she finally squeezed the trigger, the deer never knew what hit it. Later that night, her father had said she had the gift, an instinct that other hunters chased their whole lives. She hadn't gotten it then, she got it now. The middle of her stalk was a pure grinder. The sharp rock shredded her knees and elbows, but she ignored the blood. As the sun beat down, the heat became a crushing weight. Her camis were soaked with sweat, dried, then soaked again. She passed another candidate, motionless and collapsed, his skin pale from heat exhaustion. Helping him would mean failing the evolution. She kept moving. By late afternoon, she was on the final approach. A 50-meter field of tall grass separated her from the firing position. The OP was dead ahead. The instructors were glassing the area, searching for any telltale sign of movement, any form that was out of place. She could see Hessler among them, his binoculars panning methodically, like a bird of prey. Elise let herself sink into the earth, absorbing the smell of the dirt, the rustle of the grass. An ant crawled over her hand. She didn't move. She began to time her movements with the gusts of wind. Her every move mirrored the whisper of the tall grass, her ghillie suit melting her into the terrain. Still, when the wind died, moving only when it stirred, her breath faded, a ghost on the air. That 50-meter crawl had burned 90 minutes. Once set, she settled her crosshairs on the target, using her mil dots, not the rangefinder. A slow squeeze. The shot was clean, a center mass hit at 420 meters, her estimated range only off by a handful. No one had seen a thing. An hour later, she stood at parade rest as Hessler scanned her data sheet. His face was a mask, but his eyes burned holes in the paper. Staff Sergeant Thorne, his voice was clipped. Your shot placement was perfect. Your approach was by the book. A beat of silence. Elise braced for impact. However, on your final approach, Your left elbow broke the grass line 3 times. In the field, you'd be dead. The critique hit her like a punch. No spotter called it Master Sergeant. I'm a spotter, Hessler countered, his voice slick. And I just called it. He dragged a line across the sheet. A final, damning stroke. This stock is a no-go. You'll rerun it at 0600. Elise remained frozen at attention, her thoughts scrambling through SOP manuals for a loophole. She opened her mouth to argue the clear setup when a new voice cut in. Master Sergeant Hessler. Gunny Webb drew near, clipboard in hand, his pace measured and solid. I had eyes on Staff Sergeant Thorne from the alternate OP. I registered no breach of concealment. He stepped next to Elise, a clear buffer between her and Hessler, his loyalty plain. My observation is already on record. Webb presented the form, every block filled, Hessler's jaw clenched. Gunnery Sergeant Webb, this candidate is my problem. Course regs state a senior instructor resolves disputed evals. Webb replied, his tone flat but unyielding. I'll take it to the CO if I have to. The tension between them was a physical thing. Elise watched Hessler process the corner he was in, his fury barely contained. He'd been boxed in before the very student he aimed to crush. Fine, Hessler bit out, the stalk passes. He faced Elise, his voice a low threat only she could hear. Congrats, Staff Sergeant, you made it through today. Webb gave her a short, almost imperceptible nod and departed. Hessler's eyes followed him, then locked back onto her. His voice grew soft, an invasive whisper that chilled her skin. You think this is a win? He hissed. You think Webb covering you matters? He moved in close, his breath smelling of stale coffee and raw spite. The Fex is coming. 3 days out there. No one to bail you out. Just you and 100 ways to wash out. His smile was predatory. I know you're kind, Staff Sergeant. All talent, no grit. Think you're special. He shook his head. The field breaks all of them. He turned and left her on the range, the sun beating down. That night, she field-stripped her rifle on autopilot behind the barracks, her mind calculating the odds of survival. 72 hours in Sector 9 for Hessler to find one flaw to exploit. Boots crunched on gravel, shattering her focus. Staff Sergeant. She looked up. A private stood nearby, a wiry kid buzzing with nervous energy. PFC Garrett Caldwell. Same squad bay. Elise nodded sharply. She knew him, the boot who always went too hard in PT and ran his mouth. What is it, Private? Caldwell shifted his weight, looking uneasy. I saw what went down on the range with Master Sergeant Hessler. The words spilled out of him. They're gonna drop me, Staff Sergeant. My stalk's tomorrow, and I'll fail. I can't be quiet. Back home, you make noise, let the bears know you're around. Being quiet gets you killed. But here, quiet is everything. His eyes were wide with panic. She sized him up. Maybe 22, worker's hands, and a heavy accent from the hills. First one to enlist, she figured. Coal country kid. The Corps was his only ticket out. Where you from, Private? Eastern Kentucky. Harlan County. That explained it. In those mountains, noise meant life. Silence meant death. She'd have to rewire every instinct he had. I can't give you formal instruction, she said flatly. Hessler finds out, we're both done. His face fell. But, she added, if you were practicing behind the training area tonight, and I just happened by with some pointers, that's just Marines helping Marines. Hope flickered in his eyes. Thank you, Staff Sergeant. Not yet. Range office, 2100. Full ghillie. He left. She knew the risk. Hessler wanted her on a fraternization charge, any excuse to get her booted. Her father's words echoed in her mind. A sniper takes care of their own. Elise. Shooters take lives. Snipers save them. Sometimes with a bullet, sometimes by teaching a kid to stay alive. She'd promised her father she'd be that kind of Marine, no matter the cost. At 2100 sharp, Caldwell was waiting in the shadows. For 2 hours, she taught him how to become a ghost, reading terrain for cover, using shadows to vanish, thinking like the hunted, not the hunter. He soaked it all in like a drowning man grasping for air. He'd shifted his hide 3 times, each better than the last. They were discussing observation lanes when a flashlight beam cut the darkness. Hessler emerged, pinning them in the light, a male and female Marine, alone, after hours. Well, well, his voice was pure victory. What's this? Elise was up, ramrod straight. Master Sergeant, conducting peer-to-peer training. Peer training? Hessler rolled the words around. At 2200, in a hide, with a private. He shook his head, an icy smirk spreading on his face. Not the story I'm seeing, Staff Sergeant. Caldwell started to speak, but Hessler silenced him with a hand. PFC Caldwell, rack. Now, we'll chat tomorrow. He watched the private retreat, then his eyes locked on Elise. Fraternization, he stated, flipping open a notebook. Violation of MCOP 1326.2. That's an instant drop. He stepped in. I needed something solid, Staff Sergeant. Something Webb can't wave away. Something on paper. His pen scraped the page. Got it. Elise held her voice level. Nothing improper happened, Master Sergeant. I was helping a Marine with fieldcraft. Marine Corps Order 1500.61 authorizes peer instruction, an MCO that assumes professionalism. Hessler countered, 2200 hours, a dark corner, a pattern of behavior. He shut the notebook. I'm writing this up. Until the review, you're restricted to quarters. He turned to go, then paused. FEX kicks off in 36 hours, Staff Sergeant. Use that time to think about your future. I own it now. He disappeared, leaving her with the chirping crickets and the crushing weight of her career collapsing. She walked to the barracks on autopilot. Hessler would push the charge. Webb could fight for her, but the regs were absolute. A hint of this stuff was a career killer for a sniper. 8 months ago, she'd made a promise to a dying man. Now that promise was ash. On her rack, staring at nothing, she caught hushed voices from the walkway. 2 instructors. She recognized them. Hessler and Cody Vance. She needed to be gone. Eavesdropping on cadre was a faster way out than fraternization. But a raw, broken sound in Hessler's voice stopped her cold. It was a tone she'd never heard from him. She slid to the window, hugged the shadows, and listened. You don't get it, Hessler said. You think this is about standards? About the program? It's not. It was never about any of that. Vance barely breathed a word. My sister wanted to be a ranger? Hatcher's voice cracked with old grief. 15 years back, Caroline. She was a phenom, sharp, quick, tough as nails. Honor grad. The brass thought she was the real deal. He inhaled sharply. She smoked the first 2 phases. The whole family, the whole Corps, had eyes on her. My dad swore she'd be a legend. The first Hatcher in 3 generations with that tab. The quiet was heavy. Then she shattered, Hatcher said, barely audible. Week 5. Just came undone. She couldn't move another inch. They found her on her rack at 0300, just rambling. Total psych break, the docs called it. Dissociative fugue. Vance's tone shifted, softer now. What happened to her? A medical discharge, Hatcher said. 6 months inside a VA psych ward. Hatcher spoke with a deadened voice, the sound of a man describing a wound too deep for feeling. She wasn't right when she came home. Lives in assisted housing in Alabama. Can't hold a job. My father won't even say her name. The silence hung in the air. He says she disgraced the family name. Him. Thorne heard the scuff of boots on the concrete. Every time I see a female candidate here who thinks she's got the stuff, I see Caroline, Hatcher admitted. I see what this place did to her, what the pressure cooks up inside a person. His voice fell. This ain't about being cruel, Vance. It's about making sure it never happens again. It's about saving them from what they think they want. Vance murmured something Thorne missed. Hatcher's tone turned to steel again. Thorne's different, I'll give her that. She's got something these other grunts don't. But that quality is exactly what makes her a liability. The more squared away they are, the harder they drive. And the harder the drive, the bigger the wreck. He let that hang. I'm giving her every out, every chance to walk before this school breaks her. If she's smart, she'll take one. Thorne pulled back from the glass, her pulse hammering. Hatcher wasn't just a bullheaded gunny. He was a ghost, still fighting a war that ended long ago. His campaign against her wasn't personal. It was all about Caroline. And 15 years of watching his sister drift, it was about the crushing guilt that he couldn't pull her back. Knowing why didn't mean she forgave him. It didn't erase the bogus inspections or the relentless push to make her quit, but it exposed the raw nerve of his malice. And it forged her own will into iron. She wouldn't just pass for herself, she'd do it for the woman who broke under the weight Thorne now chose to bear. The frag order dropped at morning formation. Final FEX kicks off at 0500 tomorrow, Hatcher announced, his voice like gravel. 72 hours in your assigned sectors. Stalks, OPs, and UKD shots. Your score is based on stealth, precision, and mission completion. His eyes locked on Thorne. A 70% is a washout. He let it sink. Sergeant Thorne, you have Sector 9. A low rumble went through the ranks. Sector 9 was the graveyard nobody cleared 85%. It was the piece of real estate Hatcher gave to Marines he wanted to disappear. Caldwell shot her a look of raw concern from across the platoon. Thorne remained a statue, her bearing immaculate. She had seen this coming. That night, she studied a topo map from the range control shack, the squad bay a distant hum. Sector 9 was a spiderweb of contour lines, a geography built for agony. It had knife-edge ridges, impassable brush, and OPs set up for guaranteed failure. A 3-day tour in hell. But Thorne was raised in country that made Georgia look like a park. Her dad had taught her to navigate by the stars when a compass was a lie, to find water where there was none on a map, and to drive on when most Marines would be done. Hatcher thought Sector 9 was his ace in the hole. He had no idea who he was dealing with. She pulled out the worn photo of her father. Thomas Thorne stared out from a Montana field, rifle cradled, a confident smirk on his face. 3 more days, she mouthed. 3 days to the pin. Then I'll make the shot no one else can. She flipped the photo, tracing the unfinished third line. Asterisk, become a Marine Scout, sniper. Asterisk, almost home, Dad, she thought. The op began in the pre-dawn murk, candidates melting into the tree line. Thorne shouldered her pack and stepped into Sector 9, armed with her rifle, her skills, and her father's ghost. In the TOC, Hatcher watched her icon on the screen until the forest claimed it. He'd thrown his worst ground, his ultimate test, at her. Now he'd see if Thomas Thorne's daughter could take it. The 72 hours in Sector 9 were a relentless grinder. The ground was meaner than the map suggested, worse than the stories. Jagged rocks chewed her knees and elbows. The vegetation was so dense she low-crawled for hours, her ruck snagging, thorns tearing at her camis. Instructors occupied every dominant terrain feature, their binoculars seemingly knowing her next move. But Thorne wouldn't break. The first day was a battle of attrition against a sun that baked the woods into an oven. She moved through it, finding the path of least resistance, hoarding energy, becoming part of the land. Her utilities were soaked with sweat, then dried stiff, then soaked again. The bugs were savage. Her pack straps bit into her shoulders until the pain was just a dull hum. By mid-afternoon, she had her first target, an unknown distance steel silhouette in a clearing 400 meters away. No rangefinder, no spotter. Just her eyes, her gut, and the lessons her father had beaten into her. She read the mirage, the size of the target against the trees, the terrain. She called it at 420 meters. She doped the scope for the steep angle, held for a whisper of wind, and squeezed. The round impacted 2 inches left of the heart. A solid hit. She noted the grid and pushed on. Day 2 meant observation. Hours spent frozen in a hide site, sketching an enemy position while instructors prowled nearby. The stillness was its own special hell. Muscles screamed and the mind drifted. Thorne found what her dad called the quiet place, a state of total awareness where she noticed everything and nothing. She sketched, she watched, she became a rock. On the 3rd morning, she saw the tripwire, stretched taut across a trail at boot height, lost in the early shadows. It was a training device, sure, but it was also a statement. A trap laid specifically for the one Marine Hatcher wanted to see fail. Thorne froze inches away. She saw the thin line, followed it into the brush, and understood. This was his final, personal test. She carefully disarmed it, snapped a photo as evidence, and pressed on. The 3rd day delivered the final obstacle. crossing the notorious Razorback Ridge in Sector 9. A 400-meter spine of exposed rock leading to the final OP. That single crawl had shattered every candidate for the last 3 years. She started at sunrise and reached her position 8 hours later, a full workday to crawl 400 meters. She was just another shadow, another gust of wind on the unforgiving Georgia terrain. Finally in place, she lays the target. 680 meters. Her position was solid, her breathing steady. She pressed the trigger, the shot was gone. Later, the results board showed her name next to Range 9, 91%, a schoolhouse record going back 40 years. Gunny Miller stared at the numbers as if they were written in a foreign script. His dope book trembled slightly in his hand. He looked up as she approached. 91%, he said, his voice hollow. On that course, it wasn't a compliment, just utter disbelief. The ground doesn't get you, Gunny, she said quietly. My father taught me it's the fear. She held his gaze. Your sister was strong, Gunnery Sergeant. The institution is what broke her. But I'm not her. And whatever you think you're doing to save me isn't going to work. She turned on her heel, leaving him there with his stats and his ghosts. The last qualification day broke clear and hot. The survivors formed up on Toddfield Range for the final exam. 18 candidates were left from the original 24. The course had claimed 6 souls, beaten by the terrain, the heat, or their own minds. Thorne stood tall, feeling the gravity of her mission. Her father, her promise, and 3 weeks of Hatcher's personal war. It all came down to today. First was the known distance range, with steel from 200 to 800 meters. This sorted the marksmen from the snipers. Thorne ran the course like a machine. Steady breath, clean trigger press. Her group was so tight the instructor's evaluation just read, flawless. She shot a 98% right behind Sergeant Jameson Kowalski. The 31-year-old was a quiet professional, nothing but calm hands and deliberate movements. Then came the UKD range, targets scattered across broken ground at unknown distances. This was a test of a sniper's instinct, not just their training. The first target popped up at an estimated 340 meters. She dialed her dope and sent it. Impact, center of mass. The next appeared at 580 meters out. She read the boil of the heat waves, held and fired. Another hit. On the entire course, her range estimations were within 10 meters. Her skill was so absolute it made the other shooters stop and watch. The last test was the stalk, a low crawl over strange ground toward a simulated enemy post. Thorne melted into the green, only reappearing in her hide. She had the observer dead to rights. He never knew until her clean shot broke the silence. Her name was number 1 on the final list, honor grad. Staff Sergeant Elise Thorne was now a scout sniper. But Webb wasn't done. He led them to a hallowed piece of ground on Toddfield's boundary. The mythical Target 17. The target was a ghost, a flicker of steel seen through a break in the trees nearly a mile away. This is voluntary, Webb's voice cut in. You don't have to take the shot. It won't touch your qualification score. He let the challenge hang in the air, a knowing look on his face. But if you've got the stones, this is your chance. Cody Vance stepped forward, all swagger. He'd barely passed. He got on the rifle, oozing unearned confidence. He made a show of it, tweaking his scope and studying the windsocks. His first round hit the tree line 50 meters wide. The second was even worse. His third sailed clear over the steel and into the berm behind it. Vance got up, his jaw set. Damn wind, he muttered to the air. Can't get a read. He stormed off, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. Kowalski was up. He was deliberate, focused. He watched for minutes, reading the grass like a damn book. His shot kicked up dust just beyond the plate, a near thing, closer than anyone, but still a miss. He rose, gave a single nod of acceptance, and moved off, a man who knew his limits. Good try, Webb said. Kowalski just nodded. 3 more tried, all failed. The valley seemed to just eat the rounds. For 40 years, Target 17 was untouched. 847 logged attempts, and 0 impacts. Garrett Caldwell stepped to the line. His stock score was the only thing that had saved him from washing out. He stared down range like a man already defeated. He fired. The round hit dirt 20 meters short. He adjusted, fired again. Closer, but no cigar. His last round slapped the ground right below the steel. He rose, met Thorne's eyes, and gave a slight nod. "It's all you," his look said. Everyone else had either shot or bowed out. Only Thorne was left. Before she could move, Gunny Miller strode forward. "Staff Sergeant Thorne," he barked, making her rank sound like an accusation. "Here's the one who thinks she's better than 4 decades of shooters." He waved a hand at the range. 1,247 meters. Shitty thermals, a crosswind from hell, and a keyhole firing lane. Good luck. His grin was pure ice. That challenge hung heavy in the Georgia humidity. Every eye was on her. Kowalski stood with his arms folded. Caldwell looked like he was holding his breath. Vance had crept back, his face a mix of bitter envy and morbid curiosity. Webb stood off to the side, his expression unreadable. From the tower, Colonel Patricia Drummond watched through her spotting scope. Thorne moved to the line and went prone. The dirt felt solid, right. She found the target, a wavering slice of steel, in the heat. The valley's wind flags were a joke, each pointing a different direction, telling lies. The gap in the pines looked impossibly small. She ignored it. She watched the grass. 200 meters out, it bent left. At 400, a thermal made it swirl. At 600, it whipped violently. Past 800, the current reversed. In her head, she built a map of the valley's invisible rivers of air. She felt its rhythm, the heat coming off the rock, the brief calm between gusts. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, sharp and real. "The rifle's just a tool, Elise. You're the weapon. The bullet only goes where you tell it. The scope shows you the official story. Your gut tells you the truth. Trust it." She dialed her scope. 12 MOA up, 4 MOA left. The adjustment was pure instinct, a calculation that defied every manual, a setting no instructor would ever approve. Miller's voice boomed from behind her. "She's gonna miss," he announced to the crowd, "just like all the rest." Thorne breathed out, slow and steady. Her fingers settled on the trigger. Her world shrank to one point in space, just the target and the air. She squeezed. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. The crack of the shot echoed off the distant hills. The round screamed from the muzzle at 2,800 feet per second, on its way to a target that hadn't been touched in 4 decades. Thorne stayed on the scope, watching the vapor trail cut a path through the haze, a line drawn by sheer will. 1 second. The bullet crossed the halfway mark, true. 1.5 seconds. The round sliced through the narrow gap between the trees, a silver ghost. Then came the sound, a sharp, clean times ping times of lead on steel. The report of a perfect hit rolled back down the valley, declaring the impossible had just been done. For a long second, the range was dead silent. Then, Lance Corporal Caldwell broke it with a guttural yell, throwing a fist in the air, screaming something joyful and incoherent. Kowalski began a slow, measured clap that soon erupted into a wave of applause. Another Marine cheered, then another. In seconds, the whole line was on its feet, their faces a mix of pure shock and unadulterated respect. Elise pushed herself up, her hands rock steady, her breathing calm. A weight she'd been carrying for 3 weeks just vanished. The legendary shot that had broken better shooters for 40 years. She had threaded a needle through an 8-foot window from over 1,200 yards out with a cold-bore rifle. Gunny Webb approached, deep respect in his eyes, and offered his hand. "Staff Sergeant Thorne," he said, his voice low, "in 20 years, that is the single best shot I have ever seen." He squeezed her hand. "Your old man would be proud as hell." Elise just nodded, her throat too tight for words. She saw him there, in a Montana canyon, teaching a young girl to read the wind. The crowd of Marines parted for a figure striding down from the tower. Colonel Patricia Drummond walked with the no-nonsense gait of a lifer, the eagles on her collar glinting. She was in her 50s, Iron gray hair pulled back tight, her eyes sharp and assessing. She stopped right in front of Elise. "Thorn," the colonel said. "I was watching from the CP." She nodded toward the newly marked target. "I'm told you just did something nobody at this school has ever accomplished." "Yes, ma'am." Elise's voice was firm. Drummond nodded once. "I pulled your record before you got here. Top of your unit on the rifle range. 2 combat tours. A long line of stellar fitness reports." She paused. "I also read about the friction. The crap you got from some of the staff here." Elise stayed silent. She didn't need to say a word. "Be advised," Drummond said. "I'll be conducting a personal review of this course's command climate. But for now, one question." She pointed at the distant steel. "How the hell did you make that shot?" She could have spouted ballistics tables, spindrift, Coriolis, Mirage, but that wasn't the truth. "My dad used to say, impossible is just something that hasn't been done yet," she said. "He taught me to shoot in canyons just like this. To feel the currents, not just run the numbers." Her gaze found the target again. "He died 8 months ago, before I could show him I'd learned anything. Before I could prove his lessons stuck. A lump formed in her throat. I came here to prove they were everything." For a long moment, Drummond just watched her. Then she gave a sharp nod. "They were worth everything, Staff Sergeant." She turned to Webb. "Gunny, I want this documented. Get that shot in the logbook." Webb's salute was textbook. "Ah yeah, Mom." As the colonel left, another instructor broke from the group. Hessler. His face was a mask of cold rage. Pure fury blazed in his eyes, but underneath it was the unmistakable look of defeat. He walked toward her, his boots heavy on the gravel. The other Marines fell silent, sensing the showdown. He stopped in front of her. He pulled out his clipboard, the one he'd used to record every one of her supposed failures. "Target 17, he said, his voice flat and dead. "Staff Sergeant Thorne, first round impact." He wrote the words down, his hand shaking with contained anger. He ripped the page off and shoved it at Webb without looking, then turned back to Elise. She braced for a final, bitter insult. He just stared, his eyes a war of resentment and something that looked almost like shock. Then, without saying a thing, he spun on his heel and walked away. Caldwell was immediately beside her, his face glowing. "You did it," he breathed. "You really, honest to God, did it. Staff Sergeant, that was the most incredible thing I have ever seen." Elise watched Hessler's retreating back. The man had done everything in his power to break her. Now, his own ego was so shattered he'd been forced to write his own failure into the official record. "It isn't over," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Caldwell looked at her, confused. "What's not over? You made the shot. You're a sniper. What else is there?" Elise met his gaze. "Graduation," she said, "and whatever he's got cooked up for tomorrow." She knew his type. Men like Hessler don't just accept defeat. For now, she bathed in the feeling, the unshakable truth she'd bled for. She was a Marine Scout sniper. Nothing on God's green earth could ever take that from her. That evening, she went back to the deserted range, long after the praise had died down. She stood on the firing line that had forged her. The setting sun bled orange and gold across the valley. Target 17 was a pinprick miles away. She slid her dad's old photo from a pocket, holding it in the dying light. "Wish you were here for this, Dad," she murmured. "I wish you were here." A gust swept through the valley, the tall grass whispering a language she knew better than any grid coordinate. Her father taught her that the instinct to read the unseen, to grasp what others missed. She came to uphold his name, to prove a girl from Montana could be a warrior. She'd done that and then some. She discovered she wasn't just his continuation, she was her own Marine, her own woman. She turned the photo over, eyeing the faded script. Asterisk Elise's goals. Asterisk 1. Finish high school. Done. 2. Become a Marine. Done. 3. Earn the hog's tooth. She took out a pen and drew a thick, final line through the last item. It was complete. She put the photo away, her eyes sweeping the valley once more. The pinning ceremony was tomorrow, the hardware that would mark her as one of the deadliest shots in the course. But this night belonged to her, the wind and the echo of a shot the institution said was impossible for 40 years. She proved them all dead wrong. The ceremony kicked off at 1000 hours under a crisp Quantico sky. 18 Marines stood in formation, dressed blues perfect, expressions like stone. Bleachers were packed with family and fellow Marines. Cameras poised to immortalize their own becoming legends. Colonel Drummond approached the lectern, her eyes scanning the formation, knowing the hell each of them had just endured. Today, she began, her voice resonating across the parade deck, you join an elite brotherhood. The skills you've gained will make you a nightmare for our enemies. The discipline you've shown will be your foundation. She looked at each graduate, but I want to talk about more than just skill. I want to talk about shattering what's considered possible. Her gaze found Elise. Every generation thinks it understands the limits. We set our boundaries based on past failures. We build our walls on what we assume is fact. She let that hang in the air. Then someone comes along and proves our limits were just suggestions. She surveyed the new snipers. This class had forged a new legend, one that sprang from a single round that rewrote the school's standards. Her nod was deliberate. That level of lethality isn't about one Marine. It speaks for all of you. It sets a new standard for every shooter to come. The graduation proceeded with parade ground precision names called, certificates awarded, hands shaken. Each Marine stepped forward, received their qualification, and returned to formation a certified hunter of gunmen. When they called Thorne's name, the energy shifted. The applause was a physical shockwave. Every eye locked on her. She advanced, spine straight as a piling, knowing this sealed her reputation. Hessler stood beside the CO, holding the awards. His face was a mask, but Thorne saw the war behind it, the pressure in his eyes, the rigid line of his jaw. He'd been ordered here, forced to present this award to the woman he'd spent 3 weeks trying to wash out. Staff Sergeant Thorne, the colonel's voice boomed. Our distinguished honor graduate, a beat of silence. And the first shooter in this school's 40-year history to drop target 17. The room erupted. After the colonel handed her the graduation cert, she motioned for Hessler to present the commendation for her historic shot. Hessler stepped forward. Their eyes met. The world slowed. Thorne saw it all in his stare, a profound bitterness that would follow him for years. It was a grudging respect he couldn't hide anymore. And beneath that, a flicker of pure defeat, the look of a man who'd waged a war he was destined to lose. He gave her the award, his fingers brushing hers. He leaned in, his voice a low rasp, meant only for her. Your old man would be proud, he rasped. I couldn't save Caroline, but you saved yourself, stopped me from failing again. He stepped back and extended his hand. She took it. It wasn't forgiveness, not even close. It was a ceasefire. And for now, that was plenty. Thorne rejoined the formation as the ceremony wrapped up. More awards, more applause. When the last name was read, the colonel dismissed them, and the room erupted in joyful chaos. Families mobbed their newly minted snipers. Cameras flashed. Pride filled the air. She stayed on the fringe, observing the pandemonium. Kowalski was getting his shoulder pounded by a man who had to be his father. Vance stood stiffly for a picture with his wife. Before Thorne could fade out, Garrett Caldwell stood before her, smiling like he'd hit the jackpot. Staff Sergeant, he began, his voice thick with emotion. I owe you. He went for a handshake but pulled her into a quick, clumsy hug that felt more honest than any salute. You taught me more than just stalking, he whispered. You showed me what having your brother's back truly means. He pulled away, his eyes moist. Not many of us from Harlan County get this far. We made it today, thanks to you. A knot tightened in Thorne's throat. She gave a sharp nod, unable to speak. Caldwell gave a final, casual salute and vanished into the crowd. Webb materialized beside her. Staff Sergeant, he said, walk with me. They left the noise, heading for the quiet woods where they first met. That fraternization beef, Webb said without preamble. The CO reviewed it and tossed it this morning. Hessler's entire report was classified as bogus. A massive wave of relief crashed over Thorne. That's not it, Webb added. Hessler's been relieved of instructor duty. He's getting new orders. He looked her straight in the eye. What you did went beyond hitting a target. You changed the whole game for everyone. He started to leave, then paused. Every woman who follows you through this school will have it easier because you blazed the trail. Then he was gone, leaving Thorne with the Virginia pines and the sheer gravity of her success. She headed to her truck as sunset colored the sky. Inside her wallet, her father's picture now rested against her new qualification. 3 promises were written on the back of that photo, each one of them fulfilled. Every debt paid. Thorne drove off the Quantico base as darkness fell, leaving the range where she'd done the impossible, the barracks that had been her trial, the institution that tried to break her and failed. Thomas Thorne was finally at peace under the Montana earth. And on the Virginia breeze, his daughter carried his legacy forward. Staff Sergeant Thorne, a scout sniper for the United States Marine Corps, the one who hit the shot. This fight was over, but her war was just beginning. I wish you were here. A gust swept through the valley, the tall grass whispering a language she knew better than any grid coordinate. Her father taught her that the instinct to read the unseen, to grasp what others missed. She came to uphold his name, to prove a girl from Montana could be a warrior. She'd done that and then some. She discovered she wasn't just his continuation, she was her own Marine, her own woman. She turned the photo over, eyeing the faded script. Asterisk Elise's goals. Asterisk 1. Finish high school. Done. 2. Become a Marine. Done. 3. Earn the hog's tooth. She took out a pen and drew a thick, final line through the last item. It was complete. She put the photo away, her eyes sweeping the valley once more. The pinning ceremony was tomorrow, the hardware that would mark her as one of the deadliest shots in the course. But this night belonged to her, the wind and the echo of a shot the institution said was impossible for 40 years. She proved them all dead wrong. The ceremony kicked off at 1000 hours under a crisp Quantico sky. 18 Marines stood in formation, dress blues perfect, expressions like stone. Bleachers were packed with family and fellow Marines. Cameras poised to immortalize their own becoming legends. Colonel Drummond approached the lectern, her eyes scanning the formation, knowing the hell each of them had just endured. Today, she began, her voice resonating across the parade deck, you join an elite brotherhood. The skills you've gained will make you a nightmare for our enemies. The discipline you've shown will be your foundation. She looked at each graduate, but I want to talk about more than just skill. I want to talk about shattering what's considered possible. Her gaze found Elise. Every generation thinks it understands the limits. We set our boundaries based on past failures. We build our walls on what we assume is fact. She let that hang in the air. Then someone comes along and proves our limits were just suggestions. She surveyed the new snipers. This class had forged a new legend, one that sprang from a single round that rewrote the school's standards. Her nod was deliberate. That level of lethality isn't about one Marine. It speaks for all of you. It sets a new standard for every shooter to come. The graduation proceeded with parade ground precision names called, certificates awarded, hands shaken. Each Marine stepped forward, received their qualification, and returned to formation a certified hunter of gunmen. When they called Thorne's name, the energy shifted. The applause was a physical shockwave. Every eye locked on her. She advanced, spine straight as a piling, knowing this sealed her reputation. Hessler stood beside the CO, holding the awards. His face was a mask, but Thorne saw the war behind it, the pressure in his eyes, the rigid line of his jaw. He'd been ordered here, forced to present this award to the woman he'd spent 3 weeks trying to wash out. Staff Sergeant Thorne, the colonel's voice boomed. Our distinguished honor graduate, a beat of silence. And the first shooter in this school's 40-year history to drop target 17. The room erupted. After the colonel handed her the graduation cert, she motioned for Hessler to present the commendation for her historic shot. Hessler stepped forward. Their eyes met. The world slowed. Thorne saw it all in his stare, a profound bitterness that would follow him for years. It was a grudging respect he couldn't hide anymore. And beneath that, a flicker of pure defeat, the look of a man who'd waged a war he was destined to lose. He gave her the award, his fingers brushing hers. He leaned in, his voice a low rasp, meant only for her. Your old man would be proud, he rasped. I couldn't save Caroline, but you saved yourself. Stopped me from failing again. He stepped back and extended his hand. She took it. It wasn't forgiveness, not even close. It was a ceasefire. And for now, that was plenty. Thorne rejoined the formation as the ceremony wrapped up. More awards, more applause. When the last name was read, the colonel dismissed them, and the room erupted in joyful chaos. Families mobbed their newly minted snipers, cameras flashed. Pride filled the air. She stayed on the fringe, observing the pandemonium. Kowalski was getting his shoulder pounded by a man who had to be his father. Vance stood stiffly for a picture with his wife. Before Thorne could fade out, Garrett Caldwell stood before her, smiling like he'd hit the jackpot. Staff Sergeant, he began, his voice thick with emotion. I owe you. He went for a handshake but pulled her into a quick, clumsy hug that felt more honest than any salute. You taught me more than just stalking, he whispered. You showed me what having your brother's back truly means. He pulled away, his eyes moist. Not many of us from Harlan County get this far. We made it today, thanks to you. A knot tightened in Thorne's throat. She gave a sharp nod, unable to speak. Caldwell gave a final, casual salute and vanished into the crowd. Webb materialized beside her. Staff Sergeant, he said, walk with me. They left the noise, heading for the quiet woods where they first met. That fraternization beef, Webb said without preamble. The CO reviewed it and tossed it this morning. Hessler's entire report was classified as bogus. A massive wave of relief crashed over Thorne. That's not it, Webb added. Hessler's been relieved of instructor duty. He's getting new orders. He looked her straight in the eye. What you did went beyond hitting a target. You changed the whole game for everyone. He started to leave, then paused. Every woman who follows you through this school will have it easier because you blazed the trail. Then he was gone, leaving Thorne with the Virginia pines and the sheer gravity of her success. She headed to her truck as sunset colored the sky. Inside her wallet, her father's picture now rested against her new qualification. 3 promises were written on the back of that photo, each one of them fulfilled. Every debt paid. Thorne drove off the Quantico base as darkness fell, leaving the range where she'd done the impossible, the barracks that had been her trial, the institution that tried to break her and failed. Thomas Thorne was finally at peace under the Montana earth. And on the Virginia breeze, his daughter carried his legacy forward. Staff Sergeant Thorne, a scout sniper for the United States Marine Corps, the one who hit the shot. This fight was over, but her war was just beginning.